Earlier tonight, I got to talk to my first guest about today's events. He's a multiple Emmy and Peabody Award-winning journalist and the New York Times bestselling author of What Unites Us. Here is my conversation with the one and only Dan Rather. Dan, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Jimmy, thank you for having me on. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you. Thank you.
We thought the big news of the day was going to be how things went in Georgia and with the electoral vote count. But then this afternoon, Trump supporters stormed the Capitol. And we're talking a few hours before this will air. But could you give us a breakdown of what happened today and where things stand now as events continue to unfold?
Well, things are continuing to unfold during the evening, and I expect they will continue even deep into the early morning hours, because this has been an absolute, to use an frequently overworked word, but an apt word in this case. This is an absolutely unprecedented situation for our country, and a very serious situation. That basically what happened was that increasingly it appeared that the two Democratic candidates were winning and had won the Senate runoff races in Georgia. This would, of course, mean that the Democrats would have effective control of the Senate in the new Biden administration. So when that news didn't really get solidified until the wee hours of early this morning. After that, there was a rally planned in front of the White House, a pro-Trump rally. The president, I use the word incited it, you can't use any other word, incited the crowd to march down to the Capitol and to force a delay in the certification of Biden's victory. That was to be the other big headline of the day. The big headline of the day was expected to be Democrats win 2 Senate races in Georgia, and the combined congressional power in the country certified the final electoral votes. Even as Vice President Pence was presiding in the chamber, and the final certification of the Biden victory was getting underway, then this crowd stormed the U.S. Capitol. You can describe it as protesters if you like. I myself think they were certainly rioters in it. They broke windows, they were violent. They stormed the Capitol. They stormed actually into the room where the chamber, where the deliberation was happening. All hell broke loose. There was no law and there was no order for a while. You had mob violence inside the Capitol of the United States. Now, finally, the law enforcement officers, first of all, they got some reinforcements. Secondly, they sort of solidified their own response. And most of the, if not all of the, what I call the rioters, were put outside the Capitol. It's a little hard to say what the situation is at this moment, and I've emphasized that it's fluid. But here's the thing, we have never seen this in our country before, an effort to overthrow the legitimate votes of the people in a presidential election. This was, by any dictionary definition, a coup attempt, which is to say, okay, we've had an election. We, this mob, we don't agree with the outcome of the election, which even the courts have certified in their own way, and we're going to overturn it. That's a definition of a coup, and I do think this could be described as a case of domestic violence. Not everybody in this crowd of people were violent today, not nearly everybody, but there certainly were outright rioters who were taking part in domestic violence, and the overall scene was one of a coup attempt. It has failed. That's pretty much where we are.
Do you think there will be charges against these people?
Well, let's be very clear, there should be. Because if you break windows in the U.S. Capitol and go in and occupy the offices of elected representatives of the country, those are crimes. Whether they will be prosecuted or not, frankly, I have my doubts as time goes along. But there is a movement to try to identify those people who were actually breaking windows and occupying offices and bring charges against them. But the more important question for the moment, Jimmy, and I think this will play out over the next few days, is what is to be done about the President of the United States. Make no mistake, there are talks in the Capitol among some Republicans, including some Democrats, of should some move be made to remove President Trump from office in just his last 13 days. He only has 13 more days in office. That shows you how serious the situation is. I'm not saying that any of that's going to happen. under the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet secretaries agree that the president is not capable or won't carry out his duties, then they can ask the Congress to have a vote in both houses to remove the president. That's a major step. I wouldn't go so far as to say that we can expect that step to happen, but it gives you an indication again of how serious this is. When you have that kind of serious talk in the Capitol of the United States, it's a result of this unprecedented day in which, as a country, as a people, we embarrassed ourselves. In the eyes of the world, we clearly embarrassed ourselves.
How much is President Trump to blame for what happened today, and who else is to blame?
Well, I'll give you my opinion, Jimmy, but I always like to be straight with you. There are plenty of people who have other opinions. But I think that history is going to judge that President Trump primarily is responsible for what happened today. That the power of the presidency is a power to inspire and or to incite. And clearly, President Trump has been trying to incite just this kind of action. There's no, I don't see that there's any real argument about it. Yeah. The argument can be, well, he was justified in doing it, which is a false argument. But in direct answer to your question, that the buck starts with President Trump, and it goes through those members of his party, the Republican Party, not all members of the Republican Party, but a large majority of members of the Republican Party have aided and abetted the president in convincing a large section of the American public that Joe Biden would be an illegitimate president, that the election was not legitimate, and Biden wasn't legitimately elected. It started with the president. It goes through his enablers, and allies deep within the Republican Party. And then again, frankly, Jimmy, none of us can say that we don't share at least some of the blame because we have let this happen. We have reached this point in our history where we have an undisciplined mob, including some rioters and domestic terrorism, storming our own Capitol! !
Were you surprised to see how easy it was for them to break into the Capitol?
I was surprised. Perhaps I shouldn't have been. But I thought, frankly, that a combination of the Capitol Police and the Washington Police and federal forces, such as the FBI and others, would have a plan for meeting this kind of effort to a mob take over the Capitol. So I was surprised that law enforcement was not more effective. In the early going, it was not effective at all. But before we criticize the law enforcement officers, I want to know what instructions they had. I don't know what instructions they had. But in the early going, they fled the mob. They absolutely fled. They just fled the law enforcement officers, the Capitol Police and others there, just fled the scene. After a while, they began to try to get control. But in the early going, the performance was very poor. But again, that may be on orders from some other place, including somebody in the Capitol who's in charge of the force. We just have to see. But now, as we speak now, Jimmy, the National Guard has been called in. I think a strong case could be made, given the consequences of today, that the National Guard should have been standing by as this day started, because President Trump had already scheduled that rally. But nonetheless, order is being restored in the Capitol. The National Guard is now there. Things will probably simmer down somewhat over the next 12 to 24 hours. But we as a country, as a people, we're stuck with the question, what do we do now? We know this is embarrassing. We know this is not the American way. We know it's perilous. It's very dangerous to have this situation prevail. So the question is, what do we do now?
There's lots more I want to talk to you about. More with Dan Rather when we come back to Tonight Show, everybody.
Thank you, Jimmy.
On and on and on. I said, and it's on and